Recap a little. The New American Standard Version of the Bible follows the conventional reading when it says, "Looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food." According to Jewish tradition, a person does not bless the food. He blesses God who provided the food. The King James preserves the Hebrew sense. Looking up to heaven, he blessed. A Jewish writer writing to a Jewish readership need say no more. Judaism prescribes the wording for the blessing before eating bread. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. By making a blessing before breaking and eating bread, Yeshua kept a distinctly Jewish tradition. He follows the rabbinic procedure at table. The Torah commands us to bless God after we have eaten, but at no point does it command us to bless God before we eat. Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 10 says, "When you have eaten and are satisfied, you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you." Notice that all three synoptic gospels allude to this Deuteronomic formulation when they say that all ate and were satisfied. Religious Jews shared the Master's convention of blessing God before eating bread, but Rabbi Yeshua's custom of looking up toward heaven when making a blessing may have been unique to his mode of prayer. Multiplication miracle. Then he broke and gave the bread to the disciples, and the disciples gave it to the people. All of them ate and were satisfied, and from the leftover pieces they picked up 12 full baskets. Matthew chapter 14, verses 19 through 20. The Master broke the bread and the fish into pieces. His disciples distributed it to those seated. He kept breaking the bread and fish and kept giving them to the disciples to set before the people. Luke chapter 9, verse 16. Everyone had enough, as much as they wanted. John chapter 6, verse 11. They all ate and were satisfied. Luke chapter 9, verse 17. The miraculous feeding of the multitude harkens back to the famous miracles of Elijah and Elisha. The prophet Elijah once sustained a widow and her son with a handful of flour in the bowl and a little oil in the jar for several years. The prophet Elisha instructed a widow to pour off the raiments of oil from a single jar and into every available container. On another occasion, Elisha fed 100 men with only 20 wafers of barley, saying, "Give them to the people that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." They ate and had some left over. After the multitude had eaten, Rabbi Yeshua told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost." John chapter 6, verse 12. Why did he tell them to gather the leftover fragments? Rabbinic tradition regards wasting food as a sin. The fragments that remained might also symbolize the Master's teaching. He charged his disciples with the responsibility of gathering, preserving, and transmitting his teachings. The gospel narratives which compose the Chronicles of the Messiah are the fragments that remain from his teaching ministry. Likewise, the Agrapha, non-canonical sayings of the Master preserved in the writings of the early church represent fragments of the Master's teaching. As we study the words and deeds of the Messiah, we are fulfilling the Master's charge to gather the fragments that remain. The disciples filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. John chapter 6, verse 13. One for each of the 12. The 12 basketfuls allude to all Israel as represented by 12 tribes. The 12 baskets also allude to the 12 loaves of the bread of the presence in the temple. The 12 loaves which were continually in the presence of the Lord in his temple symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. The priesthood ate the 12 loaves every Sabbath and replaced them with fresh loaves. In the Second Temple era, the priesthood on this Sabbath numbered more than 1,000. The priest found the 12 loaves insufficient to feed them all. Each priest received only a morsel. According to rabbinic legend, when God's favor rested on the nation, a miracle happened. Each priest ate scarcely more than a crumb, yet that small crumb miraculously saturated him. In addition, when the priest had eaten and been satisfied, they found that leftovers remained. Every priest who received a piece of the bread, the size of an olive, would eat it and be satisfied, and some would eat it and leave leftovers. B. Yoma 38a. The miracle of Yeshua feeding the multitudes with the 5 loaves alludes to this tradition. A further correlation to the bread of the presence can be seen by combining the 2 feeding miracles. In the feeding of the 5,000, he breaks 5 loaves. In the feeding of the 4,000, he breaks 7 loaves. 5 loaves plus 7 loaves makes 12 loaves. Mark reports that the disciples also found leftover fish, sign of the prophet. When the people saw this sign that Yeshua had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet that comes to the world," Yochanan chapter 6, verse 14, that Moses spoke about. The miraculous multiplication of the loaves and fish astounded the multitude. Many interpreted it as a definitive sign from God. This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world, they declared. The Messianic title, the prophet, Hanavi, seems to be derived from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, which predicts the coming of a prophet like Moses. In other words, they suggested that Yeshua might be the Messiah, the prophet like Moses. Judaism teaches that the Messiah will be a second Moses. As a prophet like Moses, the Messiah will bring heavenly bread. Rab Barakiah has said in the name of Rabbi Yishak, the latter Redeemer Messiah will be like the first Redeemer, Moses. What does the Torah say about the first Redeemer? The first Redeemer made manna to descend, as it is written, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you." In the same way, the latter Redeemer will make manna descend, as it is written in Psalm 72:16, "May he be as abundant grain in the land." Ecclesiastes Rabbah 1:28. And it shall come to pass at that selfsame time that the treasurer of manna shall again descend from on high, and they will eat of it in those years, because these are they who have come to the consummation of times. 2 Barak 29 verse 8, and that's found in the Catholic Bible. The multiplication miracle that fed the 5,000 met the Messianic criteria and functions as the fourth definitive sign offered by the book of John. Figure 47, 7 signs of Messiah in the Gospel of John. First sign, water to wine in Cana, John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Second sign, healing in Cana, Capernaum, John chapter 4, verses 43 through 54. Third sign, healing at Bethesda, John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. Fourth sign, feeding the multitude, John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. Fifth sign, the blind men in Jerusalem, John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. Sixth sign, the resurrection of Lazarus, John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44. Seventh sign, the resurrection of Messiah, John chapter 20. A brewing revolution. Yeshua knew that they would come and capture him to make him king. Yochanan chapter 6 verse 15. When Yeshua heard the people acclaiming him as the prophet, he neither confirmed nor denied the people's acclamations. He had always tried to avoid popular messianic acclaim in crowds of that size. Herod Antipas arrested John the Immerser because he feared his large crowds might take up an insurrection. What would Antipas think of an assembly of 5,000 people gathered around a colleague of John the Immerser? And only a week or so after Antipas beheaded the Immerser, the crowd's sudden attempt to acclaim Yeshua as king made the situation politically dangerous. Tiberias was just a short distance down the coast. News of a crowd of 5,000 gathering around this mysterious Yochanan raised from the dead character would have certainly alarmed Herod Antipas. Antipas' paranoia had some merit. A crowd of 5,000 rallying behind a Messianic leader had explosive potential in the revolutionary Galilee. Josephus, the Galilean, wrote, "The Galileans are conditioned for war from their infancy and have been always very numerous, nor has the country ever been short on men of courage, or lack a large number of them." The revolutionary zealot movement had grown so large and popular that Josephus considered the Zealots a fourth sect of Judaism, along with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. A revolt seemed inevitable. Charged with messianic and apocalyptic fervor, the Zealots prepared for war and waited only for a definitive moment to unite their various terrorist organizations together and begin the wars of Messiah. They only needed the arrival of a charismatic leader who could rally the Jewish people together, preferably a Messiah. Their movement marched under the slogan, God alone reigns over Israel, a message dangerously similarly to the Master's gospel message. The reign of God is at hand. Inevitably, people confused the two slogans, and the Zealots of the Galilee rallied behind Yeshua. Darkness had fallen on the lake shore. The Zealots in a crowd of 5,000 began to stir up the multitude. Perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, Yeshua acted quickly to defuse the situation. A narrow escape. Then Yeshua urged his disciples to go down into the boat to cross ahead of him to the other side of the sea until he had sent away the people. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Yeshua knew that the crowd teetered toward declaring him Messiah with or without his permission. A violent insurrection seemed possible. The Master knew that. Somehow he and the disciples had to escape the multitude. He wanted to get back to the privacy of Simon Peter's home in Capernaum. But he did not want 5,000 people showing up the next day. To get the disciples out of danger, he forced them back into the boat and sent them away while he stayed behind to disperse the crowd. The disciples reluctantly boarded the boat in the darkness, carrying with them 12 baskets of bread. After getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. John chapter 6, verse 17. By this maneuver, Yeshua led the crowd to believe that he stayed behind with them on that side of the lake. He actually planned on privately rejoining the disciples in Capernaum, far away from the crowd of 5,000. Alone on the lake, he sent the people away and went up the mountain alone to pray. It was evening, and he was there alone. Now the boat had come halfway across the sea, and the waves were tearing it apart, for there was a wind against it. Matthew chapter 14, verses 23 through 24. Matthew and Mark both say that Yeshua dismissed the crowd and left for the mountain to pray. Mark chapter 6, verse 46. John's narrative indicates that he had to escape the crowd. To do so, he slipped away into the hills under the cover of darkness. If the church tradition, which places the feeding of the 5,000 at Tepkah, is correct, the mountain to which he retreated is the Mount of Beatitudes, where he delivered the Sermon on the Mount and often escaped to pray. Local Christians identify a small cave in this hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee as the one in which the Master prayed. The cave is visible from the modern highway below, and Christian pilgrims today leave prayer notes and votive candles in the cave. That particular night, a cold east wind suddenly sprang up. It's called the Sharkiye, dreaded by fishermen. The sea began to be stirred up because a strong wind was blowing. John chapter 6, verse 18. The small cave, or the hill above Bethsaida, granted him a bird's eye view of the lake. As the first light before dawn began to illumine the sky, the Master could see the disciples straining at the oars, for the wind was against them. Mark chapter 6, verse 48. The boat ride to Capernaum should have taken the disciples no more than a few hours to complete if they left from near Bethsaida. Even less time if they set out from Tepkah, which is less than 2 miles from Capernaum. Against that sudden stiff east wind, they found themselves pulling at the oars to no avail. They slipped further and further out into the lake, unable to make any progress at all. James and John were no strangers to the lake. Simon and Andrew were experienced boatmen, but a sudden storm in the lake could capsize and drown even the most seasoned fishermen. They took turns at oars and rudder while calling one to another. The tops of the waves splashed in froth over the sides of the boat, soaking them to their bones. The wind carved out higher waves and scooped out deeper troughs. They remembered when they were all at sea together not so long ago, and a storm had caught them by surprise. At A word from Yeshua's mouth, the wind had died, and the waves had flattened. Now, in the absence of the Master, it seemed as if the lake seized the opportunity to avenge itself for the previous insult to its dignity. The disciples did not know that the Master's eyes were upon them as they floundered on the lake.